Hey everyone, welcome to Code Contemporary Office Hours. My name is Brian Robinson. I've been doing this for a couple months now, every Wednesday morning, hopefully like some sort of clockwork, at 10 a.m. Central Time here in the lovely city of Memphis, Tennessee. So today we're going to be talking about new CSS selectors, but I've got a couple of announcements to get out of the way first, which I need to pull up my notes so I remember those. First and foremost, I'm going to be speaking at Revolution Conf in Virginia Beach. That's going to be June 6th and 7th. I'll be talking about CSS Grid there. I'm really excited to go to the beach and speak at a conference. There's apparently a luau too. So if you're watching this and you're going to randomly be in Virginia Beach June 6th and 7th, I'd love for you to go ahead and go over and buy a ticket. I'll put the link in the description below. But from all I've heard, it's been going for about 4 or 5 years now, and it's a really great conference. And there's a luau, so you can't really beat that at a tech conference, right? Other than that, the next 2 weeks, there will be no live stream. I'll be doing a little bit of traveling. But starting back up 3 weeks from now, we'll be doing some live streams again. So be sure to send any suggestions that you've got for topics for the live stream tutorials, as well as any other video topic that you're interested in. And we'll start getting those in the queue. I know that we've got a few people who have wanted to talk about CSS animations a little bit. It's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I can do the basics, so we can kind of cover that. And then one more announcement before we dive into the code today. I have a new course that I am putting the finishing touches on. It's called Pseudo Power, and it's all about using pseudo elements in CSS, specifically the before and the after pseudo elements that allow you to do some really interesting decorative elements in your CSS as opposed to adding new markup to the page. So it's really, really handy. We did a live stream on that a few weeks ago, but this is going to go and have, I think I've got 8 examples, 8 demos that are going to be in that course. I think I'm going to launch it at about $20, but if you sign up, I've got a link in the description. If you sign up to the email for notifications, I'm sending out a 50% off coupon to everyone who subscribes before I launch the course. So you can probably get it for about $10 when I launch it. It should be a pretty handy resource for you going forward. With that, I don't really have any other announcements other than to say, as we're going through the demos today, the tutorials today, be sure to add any questions over there in the comments in the chat window. There is a pretty hefty delay in the stream, and so I want to make sure that if you do have questions, whether it's about the selectors we're talking about today, CSS Grid, or really any modern development practice or professional development, I want to make sure that you get those questions in early enough that I've got time to react at the end. And I'll do some promos at the end to make sure you've got time then as well. So let's go ahead and dive in. Get my notes into a different window so that you don't have to look at them. And we're going to talk about 2 specific types of selectors today. The first is the attribute selector. Wow, I didn't click on that. The attribute selector, which has a handy MDN page, and it's all about selecting items that have specific attributes on them, HTML attributes, or attributes and values. And so we're going to go ahead and switch over to a code pen. The code pen for today's tutorials are already linked in the description. I'm going to scroll to the top, and we've got a few different examples that we're going to talk about today. A few different patterns that you can use to play with attribute selectors. I've got a little bit of CSS down in the bottom there just to limit the size of that image, as well as to help with the form examples later on. But we're going to go ahead and dive in and talk about, this isn't really production code, but it's a handy trick for testing a little bit of accessibility on your site, especially if you're using maybe user-generated content. So there are 2 very important accessibility attributes on elements. You've got the title for an anchor tag, and you have the alt text for an image. And if those aren't on there, it makes it a little bit more inaccessible. It makes your site a little bit more inaccessible. So this isn't for putting on your production website. This is more for maybe putting into your dev tool so that you can actually see if there's content on your page that doesn't have these. And so the main way that you use an attribute selector is you select an element or any selector, so a class, an ID, anything else, and then following that, you put square brackets, and you put your attribute in there. So in this case, I want to test to see if there are any anchors on this page that do not have a title attribute on them. So anchor, no space, square bracket, title, and that's going to give us a selector that we can use to target every anchor on the page that has a title. So I'm going to put a border around each of these of, let's say, 5 pixel solid green. So you can see down here we have a this is file element that has a green border around it, and up here we have an anchor that does not have any border around it. But if I were to come in here and add a title of some sort, this is a title for our anchor, you'll see that that border then goes around the anchor up top too. So that allows you to test every single anchor on the page to make sure it has a title attached to it. And that's very, very important in terms of accessibility. The other thing that's really important is alt text on your images. So alt text is going to allow you, allow a screen reader to understand what those images are all about. And you can see I've got this image here, just a placeholder image, and there's no alt tag on, oh, there is actually an alt tag. Thank you for code completion, CodePen. So CodePen really wanted me to put an alt tag on there. So we're going to, instead of specifying an element, I want to show that you can also just use the square brackets. So just like everything else, this can be on its own and allow for you to test these things. So we're just going to test and find everything on the page that has an alt tag, and we're going to say border 5 pixel solid green. So now you could scan through an entire page of images and see which ones had alt text attached to them and which ones don't. So obviously this one doesn't, so we can come in and add alt equals, this is a good description of the image, and then we apply a border to that. Now I believe, and I'm going to test this and I'm going to see if I can beat my track record last week of having things work when I've never really used them. There's also a not pseudo class, which theoretically I could put this alt in here, and then if an element on the page does not have alt text, it's going to put this border around it, and we'll make that red. And we're going to specify maybe only images for this. So images that do not have an alt tag get red. So if I remove the alt tag from this, we get a red border around it. It's a little bit more of a convoluted selector, but it selects the exclusion as opposed to the inclusion of the alt tag, which is probably more of what we're looking for in this case. So an image that does not match an alt tag. Just a handy little snippet to allow you to test all of the images on a specific page on your site. Again, not for production code, but very handy to put into your snippets in your dev tools to kind of test quickly on a page. So you can do even more with this as well. So let me go ahead and let's comment out these so we don't have those borders to look at anymore. And you can see I have an anchor here that says this is a file. And if we look at the HTML for that, I just have, this is kind of a garbage link here, but it's a link to a something.pdf file. And the cool thing about the attribute selector is that you can actually specify a string to match. And so we can come down here and we can say if the href element, or the href attribute, right, equals, I'm going to grab this entire string. We're going to talk about how we can make this a little simpler in a second. Equals quotation marks, that string, do this code. So we're going to say this is going to turn the color of our link red. So now this link up here, which has an href to a website, or actually just to this page, is still default web blue, and this link down here to a file that matches that specific string is now in red. But this isn't really all that helpful because oftentimes you're not going to have the same link to a file over and over again. So we can actually specify when there's a .pdf at the end of an href, apply this style. So instead of having this entire string, we're just going to say if the end of it is .pdf. So if, right now it's if it matches exactly .pdf, we're going to, before the equal sign, put a $sign, and that's going to say if the last characters in the string of the href match exactly .pdf, change this. So this is really handy in a content management situation where you don't want to have to apply a class just because a user attached a file. You want to dynamically generate maybe an after element on this, where we can say this after, pseudo elements, remember pseudo power coming up soon. And we're going to specify the content of this to be space PDF. And so what this does is it actually applies that snippet of content to the end of a link. So any link on this page that has a PDF attached, right, that the href goes to a PDF file, is going to dynamically get PDF at the end. And then we can specify maybe a smaller font size of maybe 0.7 and so it gets a little smaller, it has a different color. It just is a little visual indication that maybe this is a file for download. So that's a really handy thing in a content management system. You could also do this for links outside of your site. So you could say, instead of href, let's say if it has a target attribute. So if you specify that all external links maybe have target equals _ blank to make them pop up, you could specify content around that as well. So color, let's make that pink. And I don't actually have one, but let's go ahead and try to open this first in a target equals _ blank. So now we get this, which would be a pop-up in our code, but is also now able to be selected based on the attribute. Now there's a lot more you can do with attributes, and I would highly suggest going and taking a look at the MDN article about them, because not only can you do some minor things like before the first characters and after characters, you can do a lot more in terms of a little bit of regex as well. There's some new stuff coming. They're not in browsers yet about being case sensitive or case insensitive. Right now, I believe they're all case sensitive, although I'd have to double check that. So I'm about to move into talking about pseudo classes, but this is a really handy, the attribute selector is really handy, especially in dynamic content situations. It can also be used, and I'll do this demo real fast while I wait for any questions about attribute selectors, that if I wanted to have maybe a JavaScript-less tooltip, right? I could specify, let's take a look and say, if there's a data attribute with a tooltip, let's see, data tooltip. So we'll specify its own special data attribute, and we'll say this is the text to go in tooltip, right? So that doesn't come in the page, right? It's just a data attribute on the page. And then we can come down here and we can specify for everything that has data tooltip, we're going to have an after element attached to that has the content of the attribute data tooltip. And you can see that tooltip is now showing up at the end here. Let me change that color. Let's go to green. There we go. So this text goes inside the tooltip. We could then have this display none. Actually, visibility hidden is what we want. Visibility hidden. And position it, let's just put it at the bottom for now. So position absolute. We gotta have a position relative on our tooltip, on our element. There we go. All right, and then position absolute, top 100%, background color light blue, and then take this attribute and then on hover of our data of our tooltips. So you can chain all these selectors over and over again. So hover, it will produce an after element that is going to have a visibility visible. So now when I hover, you can see it pops in, and we've got width 100%, pops in over there, left 0, pops in directly beneath it, and then we could very easily fade this in by doing maybe an opacity down here, opacity of 0 up here, and transition, little transition for the animation folks, 0.3 second ease out. So now we save that in and we hover over, and it automatically fades in down here below. So there's a lot of things you can do. Obviously this is not a good looking tooltip, but you can style this after element however you need to. It automatically pulls the text from that that data tooltip attribute and is only applied to elements that have the data tooltip attribute attached to them. So it's just a really handy way of doing a lot of things without adding additional classes, without adding additional markup to your page. Pretty handy overall. So that is attribute selectors. Square braces, attribute name, you can put an optional equal sign and put a value that you're expecting with some simple regex type selectors around it. So I'm going to move into pseudo classes now. So real fast, pseudo classes differ from pseudo elements, right? So we talked about pseudo elements a few weeks ago. I've got a whole course about them coming up, but pseudo elements style specific pieces of an element. So the before and after style up the space before and after the content. There's a placeholder pseudo element that is meant to style a placeholder attribute on a form field. Pseudo classes are actually stateful mechanisms in CSS. So if you're curious as to how you can use CSS to do some simple state manipulation, that's what pseudo classes are for. You're probably familiar with the most basic of them. Hover and visited and active, right? These are specific states of a link. So when you hover over a link, you get something happens, right? The color changes, a background comes in. Visited specifically is the state of if a user has visited a link before, which we don't see as much anymore, which is interesting to me. And then active is when you've actually clicked on it. It can provide its own style. So that's states of an anchor. But we're going to go ahead and go in and take a look at states of a form field specifically right now. So I actually think this is pretty amazing. You can do front-end validation with no JavaScript required. And that's pretty handy in a lot of ways. And you can also provide specific information to the user based on these states. And so the first we're going to talk about is the idea of a required or an optional field. So that's really handy for a user to know right off the bat that they have to put in content or they don't have to put in content. So instead of actually having to put a class on our form field, on our inputs that is like class equals required or class equals optional, we don't have to add to the markup. We can actually specify required inputs, right? So the way that looks is just the colon. So if you see a single colon, we're talking about pseudo classes. If you see a double colon, we're talking about pseudo elements. So that's really the differentiation when you see those two different ways. So we're going to look at required first. So we're going to say colon required. And you could have this be any element, any selector could go before this. So we could say any input that is required could be this, or we could just leave it at required, and this will target every single input on the page that is a required input. And we're just going to simply change the border color for now. We're going to say border color, actually, we'll make it orange. I don't know. We'll see. So nothing has changed right now, and that's because the HTML needs the required attribute on this form field. So I'm going to come up, and here is my HTML, right? I've got a label that has this field is required, and then inside that I've got my input, and we've got a required attribute. Now we could very easily go in and we could do an attribute selector on this. We could say bracket required, if that's present, do this. But it's kind of handy to have this kind of different shorthand and keep those concerns separated out. So we have a border color change here that is active, right? So if I were to try to submit this form, which I don't actually have a submit button, and this won't go anywhere, right? But we can come down here, button, put never remember the actual values for these things. There we go. Submit this. So the cool thing about HTML validation, right? No JavaScript. I automatically get on click, hey, this field was required. So I can't actually style that. Each browser handles that in its own way, but it automatically says, please fill out this field. It's pretty handy to have like that. And it's going to be completely and utterly seamless in the way that you do it. You don't have to do any additional JavaScript coding to get a required field that pops up this little thing when a user submits it. And then you can also see this has that orange border that we applied to it. So you can also do this kind of the opposite too, and you could say we have optional form fields, and the border color for these is going to be green. So any field that does not have the required attribute on it has the idea of an optional form field attached to it. So you can go in, every single form field that doesn't have required gets a green border around it. Now figuring out the best use case for this is going to be kind of on your designer mind to figure that out, but it's really, really handy that we can do this. But those aren't the only two states that a form has. The cool thing about HTML validation is that we can also specify specific field types that do pattern matching in our HTML. And that gives us a valid or an invalid pseudo class attached to it. So we're going to come in, I'm going to go ahead and delete these or comment them out so we don't have to worry about any collisions in the CSS. And we're going to say valid gets a border color green, and we're going to say invalid gets a border color red. So interestingly, out of the box with no pattern matching at all, required fields that are blank get an invalid state because they are blank and they need to have something inside of them. So something to keep in mind when you're playing with this. But if we come in here and we actually specify an input type aside from text, so in this case email, which is a valid HTML form input type, if it does not end up matching the string that is expected as an email address, you will get the actual state of invalid. So if I came into this email address field and just put Brian, right, you can see sort of that there's a red border around it. Let's go ahead and make that border bigger. Let's change border 5 pixel solid. There we go. That is the valid one. That's not what I meant to change. Awesome. There we go. So when it's invalid, 5 pixel solid red. So I gave away a fun thing that I was going to mention at the end. But anyway, so you can see here the required field now has this. The email address field, if I type in Brian again, now gets that 5 pixel red border because it does not match what the browser expects of an email address. So brian@codecontemporary.com does match an email address, and I do get to have that green state around it. Now, you're also noticing that since I have just a generalized invalid pseudo class, forms as a whole can be valid or invalid, which is super handy when you're talking about maybe a longer form. It's really nice to know this is not a form that's ready to go. This is a form that is still invalid, and that's because this field is required up here. So now that I have the required field filled out and my email address in a way that is formatted like an email address is supposed to be, the entire form gets a valid state. So we'll even add that in here. 1 pixel solid green. So you can see now the entire form has a green 1 pixel border around it, denoting that this is a valid, ready to be entered form. So just interesting stuff that you can very, very easily apply to a form without having to go deep into the world of JavaScript validation. Now, JavaScript validation allows for valid and invalid not to trigger immediately on those required fields, which is kind of a pain. So that might be a reason to kind of go into that. But it does give us a lot of power with very minimal effort. Now, one other thing, and I'm going to just briefly mention this, if you're interested in it, you should definitely go do more research, is that you can actually set up patterns in your HTML's form elements to match specific types of content. So email comes out of the box, right? You put input type equals email, it's automatically going to pattern match around an email address. But you can also specify a pattern, and the pattern does actual regex, and I am by no means good at regex. It blows my mind every single time. So we're going to do a very simple pattern that is just going to match my name in either capital B, capital R, or lowercase b, lowercase r. So we're going to specify this is uppercase or lowercase b, Ryan, space, uppercase, lowercase r, Robinson, right? So now we expect the last form field there, the input that requires my name, to, if it has content inside of it, have that content match my name. So if I come in here and I put in Joseph, it doesn't work, right? If I put in Brian Robinson, it does. If I put in Brian with a lowercase b or Brian with a lowercase r, it works just the same. So this allows us, again, no JavaScript necessary, to do simple pattern matching against form fields and give a user input on, are they immediately getting these fields correct or incorrect. The faster we can limit an error, the easier it is for a user to recover from the error. So you can even see if I remove this and I just put gibberish in here, submit, oops, put some gibberish in there too. Submit that, it says please match the requested format, which there are actually ways to display that as well, but obviously not in the scope of what we're talking about today. So that's the stateful areas around a form that we can access with pseudo classes. The other aspect of pseudo classes, which I find very, very interesting, are nth child selectors. I'm going to cover those very, very quickly and do the basics because we're already 30 minutes in. So this is the last demo. So be sure that if you have any questions to go ahead and toss them over wherever it is in the chat so that I can go ahead and answer them for you. Now is your chance to put those in before we get to the end. So I'm going to come in here and we're just going to work off of our form again. And we're going to, all of our form is wrapped in labels. So each of our inputs is wrapped in a label. And I can actually specify what to do on specific numeric elements inside of that are siblings, right? So I can say we have labels, right? So we'll just have each of these have a border. Let's just do a background colors. I'm tired of borders. Background color of pink. Get rid of that semicolon, make that a colon. All right, so each of these, let's go ahead and have, I'm gonna go down below. I'm gonna add a margin to each of my labels, for margin, just so we can see this in action, 10 pixels. There we go, 30 pixels. Okay, now we can see a little bit better. And now I'm going to change the background colors on these depending on where they are numerically as a child of the form. And we're going to do that with the nth child selectors. Let me pull my notes to make sure I got those and we don't have any syntax issues coming up. There we go. So I'm going to apply, again, this is a pseudo class, so it takes a colon after whatever element or whatever selector I'm looking for. And I'm going to say if this is the nth child that is the third, apply pink. Now, if you've seen some of my grid demos, I use this quite a bit when I'm doing simple grid demos because it allows me to place content easily. But we can change that around, and it only matches the labels that are in this specific position. So if there is no fifth item, this doesn't match anything. So we can say nth child, 5, and it gets to the fifth if there's a fifth, or 2 and it gets the second one, right? Or we can specify some keywords. So we could say every even element in here gets the pink background applied. This is really, really handy for tables with table rows. You can specify table row even, apply maybe a very, very light gray background, and you get that kind of nice striped table look with no even odd in your HTML. You just get it straight up in your CSS. So you can also do the same with odd, and you get that in there pretty easily. So yeah, so this is a pretty handy mechanism. But you can also specify quote unquote formulas. So instead of doing even and odd, we could say 2n, and that's going to select every other one, right? So 2n gets me, basically it multiplies n times 2 and it finds those. So 2, 4, 6, 8, all the way down. You could also do that with 3. So if I had 6 elements inside this, 6 labels going down, this would select 3, 6, 9, 12, etc. going down the page. You can also specify where you want this to start, and that takes a plus value or a minus value. So n plus 3 is going to select every single element, n being 1n over and over again, starting at the third element. So not starting after the third element, not 3 plus. This is starting with the third child, make every other one pink. You could also say, starting with, let's say, the second one, let's start with the first one. Starting with the first one, make every other child pink. So it hits that first one, and then it hits the third one. So this actually makes the odd selector by using an even multiplier, which is fun. You could also say every third one starting with 1, and that gets us 1, 4, 7. And you can also go backwards. You can specify starting with the third, go backwards one at a time. So there's a lot of cool applications that you can do with this. Like I said, I use it quite a bit in Grid to place things when I'm doing demos. But beyond that, if you're still using float-based layouts, you could very easily every third child maybe clear your floats, maybe have a margin right 0 to make the margins work properly, as opposed to some of the kind of older clear fix hacks you have to kind of get through. Lots of things that can be done with nth child. And the cool thing is, and I'm going to go ahead and stop harping on nth child, is that you also have first child and last child as classes as well. So you know how I said I specified fifth, and it was the fifth one, but there wasn't a fifth one. How do I specify last, right? First is easy, nth child 1. Last is a little bit harder unless you have a keyword. So we have label, let me refer to my notes real fast. Maybe my last child is not what I expect it to be. Let's take a look at our HTML. The last child is technically this input. It is at the same level. So label is not actually a last child. This last label is not a last child. So if we remove the button just for the sake of brevity in the demo, now the label, which is the last child of the element, is a pink background. So first child, last child is really handy. If you are familiar with some of the challenges of doing flex-based layouts and maybe taking things from being a third to being a full width based on the amount of children, you can also specify if something is the only child. So only child. So none of ours will match that right now, but if I delete all but one label from here, so if this is a label that is the only child of its parent, it gets a pink background. So there's a lot of cool matching for content states as well as user input states. So it's pretty handy overall. So now we have a question from Danny. The question is, now with the form input patterns, you would have to know what the input is in order to do it. I can't figure out how to practically implement. So the actual patterns on the input, right? So if you're using, let me go back to my HTML. I hate scroll wheels. Let me get back to having multiple things. Pattern matching is really around text-based inputs, and it's specifically for inputs that you need to be validated in a specific way. So yes, you would need to know, there's a lot of regex you can do to make sure that, like, if you want somebody to format their phone number a certain way, phone number is actually one of the input types, but You can do a lot of stuff with like parentheses and stuff like that. That's all about kind of data validation. So whatever your backend is expecting is the pattern that you should put into your HTML, if there is a pattern. So yeah, you do need to know what you need coming out of that input to implement the right pattern in the HTML. But beyond that, I would say that using simple things like type email, type phone to make the validation kind of work for you. Type phone is going to give you, I believe, numeric regex. It's just going to match numbers. That's really kind of the bread and butter. But you can do a lot of powerful regex stuff in the input pattern to match whatever format you need a string to be to get into whatever database you're using or to get into whatever email you're trying to send. That's kind of a data validation concern more than maybe the front end concern. Does that answer the question? I kind of hope that it does. So yeah, that's my simple explanation for you do need to know what the input needs to be formatted as to make that work. So yeah. Any other questions, or if you've got a follow-up, I'll answer that. I'm going to plug a couple things real fast while I'm making sure that no one else has any questions or that Danny doesn't have a follow-up. Like I said, at the very, very beginning of the stream, I do have a new course coming out. It's called Pseudo Power, using powerful CSS before and after elements, those pseudo elements that I mentioned. If you come here, again, the link is in the description down below, and sign up for the email associated with this. I will automatically send out to you a 50% off code that will be able to be used when the course goes live. So instead of the 20 bucks that I'm probably going to charge for it, you'll get it for 10. And I think that it's going to be another 2 hours or so of content, all about 8 different patterns and designs that you can do with pseudo elements. We're going to be doing overlays, some cool border stuff, a couple neat link ideas. The CSS only tooltips, I do a little bit more styling in the course than I did in this quick example today, as well as doing a couple cool like filigree decorative elements that don't really belong in HTML to kind of show off some of the power of that. So definitely sign up for this course. You can either go to codecontemporary.com or click the direct link in the description. And I still have live currently, if you are not already a student of Practical CSS Grid, it is also available at that same link. This one is again about 2 hours of content. It gets you through 5 different big demos of how to use Grid in production. You can copy and paste that code out and you'll get some really interesting new layouts. If you haven't learned Grid yet, it's a great way to get started. And you can kind of take a look at all the course content on that. Maybe even just get a feel for my my course style, because Pseudo Power is going to follow a very, very similar pattern as well. And then yeah, that's the plugin on Pseudo Classes, on the attribute selector. HTML validation is super fun to kind of look into. It's, again, regex isn't my best jam out there. And then, as always, if you haven't already, click that subscribe and that alert button to make sure that you know when I go live every week, as well as when I post new videos. I'm trying to get in a little bit of a better rhythm on releasing new videos that are not just the live videos over and over again. So I appreciate the time that you spent with me today. If you weren't drinking some tea or drinking some coffee, I would, say caffeinate up. And we will see you not next week, not the week after, but 3 weeks from today. We'll get back into the live office hours. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.